Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's story, I think it would be interesting if you could tell me in the comments which city in the world you're watching this video from. Leave your comments so we can see how far this story has reached. Click the like button and subscribe. All of this because Tom Briggs killed the engine of his battered pickup truck and stepped out into the crisp Alaskan air. The scent of pine and wilderness filled his nostrils as he surveyed the familiar clearing. His small log cabin stood sentinel against the encroaching forest, just as it had for the past 15 years. "Home sweet home," Tom muttered, stretching his back. He began unloading his gear and the results of his successful hunt. A young bull moose that would keep him fed through the long winter months. As he worked, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. Inside the cabin, Tom busied himself with storing the meat. The old freezer hummed to life, ready to preserve his hard-won bounty. He paused, listening to the silence broken only by the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves. "Getting jumpy in your old age, Briggs," he chuckled to himself. As night fell, Tom stoked the wood stove and settled into his favorite chair with a steaming mug of coffee. The warmth and familiar surroundings slowly eased the tension from his muscles. Just as he was about to doze off, a sharp crack outside jolted him awake. Tom's hand instinctively reached for the rifle propped against the wall. He stood, every sense on high alert. Another noise, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. "Probably just a moose," Tom whispered, trying to convince himself. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon cast an eerie glow over the clearing, but he couldn't make out any movement. Tom's heart raced as he debated his next move. Gripping his rifle tightly, Tom eased open the cabin door. The cold night air hit him like a slap to the face, sharpening his senses. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. "Hello?" he called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. No response came, save for the whisper of wind through the pines. Tom took a few cautious steps into the yard, straining his eyes and ears for any sign of an intruder. After several tense minutes, he let out a shaky breath. "Get a grip, old man," Tom muttered, shaking his head. He turned back to the cabin, eager to return to its relative safety. As he reached for the door handle, a low, rumbling growl froze him in place. Tom's blood ran cold as he slowly pivoted, raising his rifle. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a massive brown bear. Its eyes glinted in the moonlight, fixed squarely on Tom. For a moment that stretched into eternity, man and beast regarded each other. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear melted back into the shadows of the forest. Tom stumbled inside, slamming and bolting the door behind him. His hands shook as he double-checked every lock and window. The night suddenly felt oppressive, full of unseen dangers. Sleep eluded Tom as he sat vigil by the wood stove, rifle across his lap. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every gust of wind set his nerves on edge. He found himself straining to hear any sound that might indicate the bear's return. As the first hints of dawn lightened the sky, Tom's exhaustion finally overcame his fear. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and glinting teeth. The sound of scratching jolted Tom awake. He blinked, disoriented, as sunlight streamed through the cabin windows. For a moment, he thought the events of the night had been nothing more than a nightmare. Then he heard it again, unmistakable scratching, followed by a low grunt. "No," Tom whispered, his mouth dry. "It can't be." He rose on unsteady legs, gripping his rifle like a lifeline. The scratching intensified, coming from the rear of the cabin where he stored the moose meat. Tom's mind raced. Had he secured everything properly? With trembling hands, he dialed the emergency radio. Static crackled, but no response came. Tom's isolation hit him like a physical blow. "This is Tom Briggs," he said into the radio, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've got a bear situation at my cabin. If anyone can hear this, I need help." Only static answered him. Tom set the radio down, his resolve hardening. He was on his own. The scratching suddenly stopped. Tom held his breath, listening intently. Silence stretched for one heartbeat, then two. Just as he began to relax, an ear-splitting roar shattered the morning calm. Tom stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the floor. The entire cabin seemed to shake as something massive collided with the rear wall. Wood splintered, and Tom caught a glimpse of brown fur and gnashing teeth through a widening gap. "Oh God!" he gasped, scrambling for his weapon. The bear's roars filled the air as it tore at the cabin wall, driven into a frenzy by the scent of meat. Tom's hands shook as he chambered around, knowing that his next actions would determine whether he lived or died. As the first chapter drew to a close, Tom Briggs stood alone in his besieged cabin, facing a primal force of nature that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. The true test of his survival skills was about to begin. Dawn broke over the Alaskan wilderness, casting long shadows across Tom's battered cabin. He hadn't slept, his rifle clutched tightly as he kept vigil through the night. With trembling hands, he unbolted the door and stepped outside. The crisp morning air did little to calm his nerves as he surveyed the damage. Deep claw marks scarred the logs, and the meat storage door hung askew. Tom's heart sank as he approached. "No, no, no," he muttered, seeing the carnage inside. Half his winter stores lay strewn about, torn packaging and gnawed bones testament to the bear's feast. Massive paw prints in the mud confirmed his fears. This was no ordinary black bear, but a hulking brown bear, likely a male in his prime. Tom knelt, examining a print. Must be at least 9 feet standing. Christ. He hurried back inside, grabbing his satellite phone. No signal. The radio crackled uselessly. Isolation pressed in on him as he realized help wasn't coming. Tom set to work, securing what meat remained and reinforcing the cabin's weak points. As he hammered boards across windows, a twig snapped in the nearby brush. He froze, scanning the tree-line. Nothing moved, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Tom backed slowly towards the cabin, never taking his eyes off the forest's edge. Once inside, he slumped against the door, his heart pounding. "Get it together, Briggs," he told himself. "You've got to get out of here." Tom gathered essentials into his pack, determined to hike out to the nearest ranger station. He stepped outside, keys in hand, only to stop short at the sight of his truck. All 4 tires were shredded, the hood dented where something massive had apparently sat. Tom's shoulders slumped as the reality of his situation sank in. A low growl from the underbrush sent him scrambling back inside. He slammed the door shut, fumbling with the locks as adrenaline surged through his veins. "This isn't happening," Tom whispered, peering out the window. The bear emerged from the trees, its massive frame dwarfing everything around it. It lumbered towards the cabin, drawn by the lingering scent of meat. Tom's mind raced. He'd dealt with problem bears before, but never one this bold, this determined. As the bear circled the cabin, testing for weaknesses, Tom realized this was no longer about protecting his supplies. This was a fight for survival. Hours passed in a haze of terror as the bear probed the cabin's defenses. Tom moved from window to window, shouting and banging pots in a desperate attempt to drive it off. But the bear remained, its persistence unnatural. As afternoon faded into evening, an eerie calm settled over the clearing. Tom strained his ears, listening for any sign of the bear's presence. The silence was almost worse than the earlier assault. Exhaustion tugged at him, but Tom knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He checked and rechecked his weapons, running through scenarios in his mind. A sudden crash of breaking glass shattered the silence. Tom whirled to see a massive paw swipe through a window he'd failed to secure. He raised his rifle, hands steady despite his fear. "Gent back," he roared, firing a warning shot into the air. The bear recoiled momentarily, then renewed its assault with increased ferocity. "T2. Got to stop the bleeding," he muttered, forcing himself to focus. With trembling hands, Tom tore strips from his shredded shirt, fashioning crude bandages for his worst wounds. The task was arduous, and he had to pause frequently as waves of dizziness washed over him. As he worked, Tom's eyes kept darting to the massive form of the bear, still lying motionless where it had fallen. Despite his dire situation, a spark of pride flickered in his chest. He had faced the beast and survived. "Not out of the woods yet, old man," Tom reminded himself. Once he had done what he could for his injuries, Tom turned his attention to his next challenge, signaling for help. He knew he was in no condition to make the long trek to the nearest ranger station. Tom dragged himself to the remains of his emergency kit, relief washing over him as he found the flare gun still intact. With shaking hands, he loaded it and crawled to the cabin's entrance. "Trees," he whispered, aiming the flare gun skyward. "Someone be out there." Tom fired, watching the bright red flare arc into the sky. He fired 2 more in quick succession, using up all his flares. Now all he could do was wait and hope someone had seen them. Hours passed. Tom drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain and blood loss taking their toll. In his more lucid moments, he forced himself to take sips of water, knowing dehydration could kill him as surely as his wounds. As the sun began to set, Tom's hopes began to fade. He found himself talking aloud, perhaps to keep himself company, perhaps to stave off the encroaching darkness. "Should have listened to Sarah," he mumbled, thinking of his daughter who had begged him to give up his solitary life in the wilderness. "She always said this place would be the death of me." A sound caught Tom's attention, a faint buzzing, growing louder. His heart leapt as he recognized it. An airplane. "Here," Tom shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm here." He tried to stand, to wave his arms, but his body betrayed him. Tom collapsed, watching helplessly as a small plane passed overhead, seemingly oblivious to his plight. "No," Tom groaned, despair washing over him. "Please no." As if in response to his plea, the plane banked sharply, circling back. Tom's eyes widened as he saw it was a park ranger plane, its distinctive markings clearly visible as it flew low over the clearing. "Thank God," Tom whispered, tears of relief stinging his eyes. The plane circled once more before disappearing from view. Tom knew they had seen the destruction of his cabin and would be sending help. He just had to hold on a little longer. As he waited, Tom's mind began to wander. The pain in his body seemed to recede, replaced by an odd sense of detachment. He found himself reliving moments from his life, his wedding day, the birth of his daughter, his first solo hunting trip. "Quite a life," Tom mused, a faint smile on his cracked lips. The sound of an approaching helicopter roused Tom from his reverie. He blinked, trying to focus on the bright lights now illuminating the clearing. Suddenly, the bear's massive form stirred. Tom's heart leapt into his throat as the creature slowly rose to its feet, apparently roused by the noise and commotion. "No," Tom gasped, reaching for his rifle only to find it just out of reach. "Not now. Not when I'm so close." The bear swayed on its feet, clearly disoriented and badly wounded. "It's one good I swept the clearing before locking onto Tom's prone form." Time seemed to stand still as man and beast regarded each other. Tom could see the pain and confusion in the bear's eye, mirroring his own exhaustion and suffering. To Tom's amazement, the bear made no move to attack. Instead, it turned away, limping towards the tree line just as the helicopter touched down in the clearing. "Unbelievable," Tom whispered, watching the bear disappear into the forest. Park rangers poured out of the helicopter, weapons ready. They quickly secured the area before rushing to Tom's side. "Mr. Briggs?" One of them shouted over the noise of the rotors. "Can you hear me?" Tom nodded weakly, relief washing over him. "Bear," he managed to croak. "Wounded. In the trees." The rangers exchanged glances, clearly torn between tending to Tom and pursuing the injured animal. "Don't," Tom said, summoning the last of his strength. "Let it go. We both survived. That's enough." As the rangers began to treat his wounds and prepare him for evacuation, Tom felt an odd sense of peace settle over him. He had faced nature at its most primal and come out the other side. Though the road to recovery would be long, he knew he would carry this experience with him forever. The last thing Tom saw before they loaded him into the helicopter was the vast Alaskan wilderness stretching out before him, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Despite everything, he felt a profound connection to this land and a deep respect for the creatures that called it home. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying him towards safety and civilization, Tom Briggs closed his eyes, grateful for his survival and forever changed by his encounter with the wild. The rhythmic thrum of the helicopter's rotors filled Tom's ears as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The park rangers worked efficiently around him, their voices a blur of medical jargon and urgent commands. "Stay with us, Mr. Briggs," a young ranger named Mike encouraged, checking Tom's vitals. "We're almost to the hospital." Tom managed a weak nod, his mind still reeling from the events of the past few days. The pain in his body felt distant now, overshadowed by a profound sense of relief and lingering disbelief at his survival. As the helicopter began its descent towards Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, Tom's thoughts turned to the bear. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for the creature's tenacity and will to survive, a mirror of his own. The landing pad came into view, a team of medical professionals already waiting. As soon as the helicopter touched down, Tom was whisked away on a gurney. The bright lights of the hospital interior, a stark contrast to the dim cabin he'd been trapped in for days. Nail, mid-60s, multiple lacerations and possible internal injuries from a bear attack. One of the rangers reported to the waiting doctors. "He's been out there for at least 3 days. Tom tried to focus on the faces around him, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking him. As they wheeled him into the emergency room, he finally allowed himself to relax, knowing he was in safe hands at last. Hours later, Tom awoke in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors replacing the sounds of wilderness he'd grown accustomed to. A nurse noticed he was awake and approached with a smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Briggs," she said warmly. "You've been through quite an ordeal. How are you feeling?" Tom attempted to speak, his throat dry and voice raspy. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly," he managed, attempting a weak smile. The nurse chuckled, offering him some water. "Well, you're not far off. The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your injuries. But you should know, you're incredibly lucky to be alive." As if on cue, a doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Briggs, I'm Dr. Simmons. You've got quite the story to tell, I hear." Tom nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "How bad is it, Doc?" Dr. Simmons pulled up a chair, his expression serious but not grave. "You've sustained multiple lacerations, some deep enough to require stitches. There's significant bruising across your torso, and you've got 2 cracked ribs. We were concerned about internal bleeding, but thankfully that doesn't seem to be an issue. You're also dealing with mild hypothermia and dehydration, but we're addressing those." Tom absorbed the information, realizing just how close he'd come to death. "What's the recovery look like?" "You'll be with us for at least a week," Dr. Simmons replied. "After that, it'll be several weeks of rest and physical therapy. But given the circumstances, Mr. Briggs, I'd say you're extremely fortunate. Many don't survive encounters like yours. As the doctor continued explaining the treatment plan, a commotion outside the room caught their attention. Raised voices could be heard, one of them insistent and familiar to Tom. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Sarah, Tom's daughter, rushed in. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair disheveled from what had clearly been a hasty journey. "Dad!" she cried, rushing to his bedside. "Oh my God, Dad! I came as soon as I heard." Tom felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at his daughter. "Sarah," he whispered, reaching for her hand. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm okay." Sarah gripped his hand tightly, tears flowing freely now. "When the Rangers called, I thought I'd lost you." Dr. Simmons quietly excused himself, giving the family some privacy. Tom patted the bed, inviting Sarah to sit. "I'm tougher than I look," he said, attempting to lighten the mood. "Takes more than an oversized teddy bear to keep your old man down." Sarah let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "This isn't funny, Dad. You could have died out there, alone." The weight of her words hit Tom hard. He'd always prided himself on his self-reliance, his ability to survive in the wilderness. But facing death, truly facing it, had shifted something in him. "You're right," he admitted softly. I didn't think about what it would do to you. Losing your mom was hard enough." "I'm sorry, Sarah." She squeezed his hand, her expression softening. "I'm just glad you're alive. But Dad, please, no more solo trips to the cabin. Promise me." Tom hesitated, years of independence warring with the love for his daughter and the fresh memory of his brush with death. Finally, he nodded. "I promise, sweetheart. No more solo trips." As Sarah smiled through her tears, a park ranger appeared at the door, looking apologetic for the interruption. "Mr. Briggs? Sorry to intrude, but we need to ask you some questions about the incident for the official report." Tom nodded, gesturing for the ranger to enter. "Might as well get it over with. Sarah, you should hear this too." The ranger, introducing himself as Ranger Thompson, took out a notepad. "Can you walk us through what happened, Mr. Briggs?" Tom took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his ribs, and began recounting the harrowing tale. He described the initial encounter, the days of siege, and the final, desperate battle in the cabin. Sarah listened, her eyes wide, occasionally gasping at particularly intense moments. As Tom finished his account, Ranger Thompson shook his head in amazement. "That's quite a story, Mr. Briggs. In all my years, I've never heard of a bear behaving quite like that. You said it was wounded when it left." Tom nodded. "Yes, pretty badly. I hope it survived, actually. Seems only fair, after everything." The ranger made a few more notes. "We'll keep an eye out for it. A bear that bold might need to be relocated for everyone's safety. But given its injuries, there's a good chance nature will take its course." As Ranger Thompson prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "One more thing, Mr. Briggs. The resilience you showed. It's remarkable. And please, for everyone's sake, consider investing in a satellite phone for future trips." Tom chuckled weakly. "Believe me, Ranger, that's at the top of my list, right after a new cabin." As the ranger left, Sarah turned back to her father, her expression a mix of awe and lingering concern. "Dad, I had no idea. All those times you went up there alone, I never realized the dangers." Tom reached out, patting her hand. "It's a different world out there, Sarah. Beautiful but unforgiving." This was a wake-up call. For both of us, I think. Sarah nodded, a determined look crossing her face. "We'll figure it out, Dad. Together. Maybe I could come with you sometimes. Learn the ropes." Tom felt a warmth spread through his chest, one that had nothing to do with his injuries. "I'd like that, sweetheart. I'd like that a lot." As the day wore on, Tom drifted in and out of sleep, his body finally allowing itself to truly rest. The road to recovery would be long, but with Sarah by his side and a new perspective on life and survival, Tom Briggs felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled Tom's nostrils as he gripped the parallel bars, his knuckles white with effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he took another painful step forward. "That's it, Mr. Briggs," encouraged his physical therapist. "Sarah, no relation to his daughter. You're doing great. Just a few more steps." Tom gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain. His body, once strong and capable of surviving the harshest wilderness, now struggled with this simple task. But he was determined. With a final burst of effort, he reached the end of the bars. "Excellent work," Sarah beamed, helping Tom into a nearby wheelchair. "You're making remarkable progress." Tom nodded, too out of breath to speak. As his breathing steadied, he looked out the window at the Fairbanks skyline. It had been 3 weeks since the bear attack, and while his body was slowly healing, his mind was another matter entirely. Later that evening, Tom lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet save for the soft beeping of monitors, but in his mind, he could still hear the bear's roars, still feel the terror of those long nights in the cabin. A soft knock at the door roused him from his thoughts. "Dad," his daughter Sarah peeked in. "You up for a visitor?" Tom managed to smile. "Always for you, sweetheart." Sarah entered, carrying a small duffel bag. "I brought you some things from home," she said, setting the bag down. "How was PT today?" "Brutal," Tom admitted, "but necessary. Doc says I might be able to go home next week if I keep improving." Sarah's face lit up. "That's great news, Dad." Her smile faltered slightly. "But where is home going to be? The cabin is a wreck," Tom finished. "I know. I've been thinking about that." He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Truth is, I'm not sure I'm ready to go back there. Not yet, anyway." Sarah took her father's hand. "You know you're always welcome to stay with me and Mike in Anchorage. We've got plenty of room." Tom squeezed her hand gratefully. "I appreciate that, sweetheart. I might take you up on it at least for a while. But it's not the same as having your own place," Sarah finished, understanding in her eyes. Tom nodded. "Exactly. I've lived on my own for so long. The idea of being in the city, surrounded by people." He trailed off, a haunted look crossing his face. Sarah leaned in, concern etched on her features. "Dad, have you been having nightmares again?" Tom hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Every night," he admitted. "I'm back in the cabin, but this time, I can't fight the bear off. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I can't breathe." Dad," Sarah whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. "Have you talked to anyone about this? A therapist, maybe?" Tom shook his head. "You know me, Sarah. I'm not one for talking about my feelings." "I know," Sarah said gently. "But this isn't just about feelings, Dad. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's okay to need help processing that." As if on cue, there was another knock at the door. Dr. Simmons entered, clipboard in hand. "Evening, Mr. Briggs. How are we feeling today?" Tom straightened up, putting on a brave face. "Better every day, document. When can I bust out of here?" Dr. Simmons chuckled. "Well, your physical recovery is progressing nicely. But Mr. Briggs, I have some concerns about your psychological state." Tom tensed. "What do you mean?" The doctor pulled up a chair. "The nurses have reported that you've been having frequent nightmares. You're showing signs of anxiety, particularly when discussing returning to your cabin. These are common symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD." Tom frowned. "PTSD? Doc, I'm not some soldier coming back from war. I'm just an old man who had a run-in with a bear." Dr. Simmons leaned forward. PTSD isn't limited to combat veterans, Mr. Briggs. Any life-threatening experience can trigger it. What you went through, it was a prolonged, terrifying ordeal. It's natural for your mind to need time to process that. Tom fell silent, absorbing this information. Sarah spoke up. What can we do to help, doctor? I'd like to refer your father to a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery, Dr. Simmons replied. Additionally, I think it would be beneficial for Mr. Briggs to stay in a supportive environment after discharge, somewhere he feels safe, but not isolated. Sarah nodded. He can stay with me in Anchorage. We've already discussed it. Tom looked between his daughter and the doctor, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. I appreciate the concern, both of you, but I'm not sure I'm cut out for city living. And talking to a shrink. He shook his head. Dad, Sarah said gently, remember what you promised me? No more solo trips. This is part of that. Please, just give it a try. Tom sighed, seeing the worry in his daughter's eyes. Alright, he conceded. I'll give it a shot, but I'm not making any long-term promises. Over the next few days, Tom worked hard at his physical therapy, pushing himself to regain his strength. But as his body healed, the nightmares intensified. He found himself dreading sleep, often staying awake late into the night, watching mindless TV to avoid closing his eyes. The day before his discharge, Tom had his first session with Dr. Elena Martinez, the trauma therapist. He sat stiffly in her office, feeling out of place among the comfortable furniture and calming artwork. Mr. Briggs, Dr. Martinez began, her voice warm and professional. Why don't you tell me a bit about what brought you here? Tom shifted uncomfortably. Well, I suppose you've read my file. Had a run-in with a bear up at my cabin. Doctors seem to think I'm not handling it well. Dr. Martinez nodded. And what do you think? How would you say you're handling it? Tom was silent for a moment, considering. I'm alive, he said finally. I survived. Isn't that handling it well? Survival is certainly an achievement, Dr. Martinez agreed. But survival isn't just about making it through the immediate danger. It's also about being able to live fully in the aftermath. Are you able to do that, Mr. Briggs? The question hit Tom hard. He thought about the nightmares, the anxiety that gripped him at the thought of returning to his cabin. The way loud noises made him jump now. I'm not sure, he admitted quietly. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. That's okay, Mr. Briggs. Recognizing that there's room for improvement is the first step. We'll work together to help you process what happened and develop coping strategies for when the memories become overwhelming. As the session progressed, Tom found himself opening up more than he expected. He described the terror of those long nights, the helplessness he felt, the moment he thought it was all over. To his surprise, talking about it didn't make the memories worse. Instead, he felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. The next day, Tom was discharged from the hospital. Sarah helped him into her car, his bag of belongings in the trunk. As they pulled away from the hospital, Tom watched the familiar landscapes of Fairbanks give way to the highway leading to Anchorage. You okay, Dad? Sarah asked, noticing his silence. Tom nodded slowly. Yeah, just thinking. The strange, leaving like this. I've lived up here for so long. Sarah reached over, patting his hand. It's not forever, Dad. Just until you're back on your feet. The drive to Anchorage was long, giving Tom plenty of time to reflect. As they passed through stretches of wilderness, he found himself scanning the tree-line, half expecting to see a bear emerge. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. Finally, they arrived at Sarah's home in Anchorage. It was a modest two-story house in a quiet suburb, a far cry from Tom's remote cabin. Sarah's husband, Mike, greeted them at the door. Welcome, Tom, Mike said warmly, helping with the bags. We've got the guest room all set up for you." Tom nodded gratefully, feeling a mix of appreciation and discomfort. The house was lovely, but it felt alien to him. The neatly manicured lawn, the neighbors' houses visible on either side. It was all so different from the rugged isolation he was used to. Over the next few weeks, Tom settled into a routine. Physical therapy 3 times a week, sessions with Dr. Martinez, and quiet evenings with Sarah and Mike. He tried to keep busy, helping with small household tasks as his strength returned. But the nightmares persisted, and he often found himself restless, missing the sounds and smells of the forest. One evening, as they sat on the back porch after dinner, Sarah broached the subject. "Dad, how are you really doing? And don't say fine. I know you better than that." Tom sighed, looking out at the neatly fenced backyard. "I'm grateful for everything you and Mike have done, Sarah. Truly." But he hesitated. "But it's not home," Sarah finished softly. Tom nodded. "I feel caged, like I can't breathe properly. I know it's not rational, but I miss the open space, the solitude." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Have you talked to Dr. Martinez about this?" "Yeah," Tom admitted. "She says it's normal to feel this way, that I need to give myself time to heal. Not just physically, but mentally." Sarah nodded. "She's right, Dad, and you are healing. I can see it, even if you can't yet." Tom managed a small smile. "When did you get so wise, kiddo?" Sarah laughed. "Must have gotten it from my old man." As the weeks turned into months, Tom did begin to see progress. The nightmares became less frequent, though they didn't disappear entirely. He found himself able to talk about the attack without his heart racing, and he even started to enjoy some aspects of city life, particularly the time spent with his daughter and son-in-law. But the call of the wilderness never fully faded. Tom often found himself staring at maps of his old stomping grounds, wondering about his cabin, about the bear that had nearly ended his life. It was during one of these moments, about 4 months after the attack, that Sarah found him in the guest room, poring over a topographical map of the area around his cabin. "Planning a trip?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Tom looked up, a mix of guilt and determination on his face. "I think it's time, Sarah. I need to go back." Sarah sat on the bed beside him, her expression worried. "Are you sure, Dad?" Dr. Martinez said dash. "I know what she said," Tom interrupted gently. "And I've taken her advice. I've given myself time, I've worked through a lot. But I can't move forward until I face this. I need to see the cabin, to reclaim that part of my life." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Tom's surprise, she nodded. "Okay, but I'm coming with you." Tom started to protest, but Sarah held up a hand. "Non negotiable. Dada. Remember your promise. No more solo trips. We'll go together." Tom felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by his daughter's love and support. "All right," she agreed. "We'll go together." As they began to plan the trip, Tom felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. He knew returning to the scene of his near-death experience wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary, not just to face his fears, but to reconnect with the part of himself that had always found peace in the wilderness. The night before their departure, Tom stood at the window of the guest room, looking out at the city lights of Anchorage. He thought about the journey ahead, about the cabin that had been both his haven and his prison. He thought about the bear, wondering if it had survived, if it still roamed those woods. For the first time in months, the thought didn't fill him with terror. Instead, he felt a sense of respect for the bear, for the wilderness, and for his own resilience. Whatever awaited him at the cabin, Tom Briggs was ready to face it. As he turned away from the window, Tom caught sight of his reflection. The man looking back at him was older, more weathered, but there was a strength in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He had survived, he had healed, and now he was ready to reclaim his life. was in deep breath, Tom began to pack for the journey ahead, knowing that whatever challenges lay in store, he wouldn't face them alone. The crunch of gravel under the tires of Sarah's SUV broke the silence as they approached Tom's property. The familiar landscape came into view, a mix of dense forest and open clearings. But Tom's eyes were fixed on the path leading to his cabin. "You okay, Dad?" Sarah asked, glancing at her father with concern. Tom nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just a lot of memories." As they rounded the final bend, the cabin came into view, or rather what was left of it. The once sturdy structure now stood as a stark reminder of the ferocious battle that had taken place there months ago. Sarah parked the car, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Tom stared at the ruins of his home, his sanctuary turned battlefield. "Oh, Dad," Sarah whispered, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Tom took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Well, no use sitting here gawking. Let's take a look." They exited the vehicle, the crisp Alaskan air filling their lungs. Tom approached the cabin slowly, each step deliberate. The roof had partially collapsed, and claw marks scarred the remaining walls. Nature had already begun to reclaim the site, with small plants pushing through the floorboards. As Tom stood in what used to be the main room, memories flooded back. The terror of those nights, the desperate fight for survival. But instead of the panic he expected, he felt a strange sense of calm. "It's so strange," he murmured. "Standing here now, it almost doesn't seem real." Sarah walked up beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "But it was real, Dad, and you survived it." Tom nodded, running his hand along a splintered beam. "Then I did." They spent the next hour carefully going through the remains of the cabin, salvaging what they could. Tom found a few treasured photos miraculously unscathed, and his old hunting rifle, battered but intact. As they worked, a park ranger vehicle pulled up. Ranger Thompson, the same officer who had interviewed Tom in the hospital, stepped out. "Mr. Briggs," he called, approaching with a folder in hand. "Thought I might find you here. How are you holding up?" Tom straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Ranger Thompson, I'm doing all right, all things considered. What brings you out here?" The ranger held up the folder. "Got the official report on your incident. Thought you might want to see it, get some closure." Tom hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Appreciate that. Why don't we sit down and go through it?" They found a relatively clear spot near the cabin, and Ranger Thompson opened the folder. "We've compiled all the information we have on the attack, including your statement and our subsequent investigation of the area." As the ranger began to read, Tom listened intently. The clinical description of the events felt surreal, so different from the visceral memories he carried. "Based on the evidence at the scene and your account," Ranger Thompson continued, "we believe the bear was a large male brown bear, likely over 1,000 pounds. The unusual aggression and persistence it displayed might be attributed to a combination of factors: possible previous human contact, the scent of the stored meat, and potentially some underlying health issues." Tom nodded, absorbing the information. "Any sign of it since?" The ranger shook his head. "We tracked blood trails leading away from your cabin, but they disappeared after about a mile. Given the injuries you described inflicting, it's unlikely the bear survived long after leaving your property." A mix of emotions washed over Tom: relief, sadness, and a strange sense of respect for the creature that had nearly ended his life. "We've increased patrols in this area," Ranger Thompson added, "and posted additional warnings for hikers and campers. Your experience has actually helped us improve our bear safety protocols." As they finished going through the report, Sarah, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "So what happens now? With the cabin, I mean?" Ranger Thompson closed the folder. "Well, that's up to you, Mr. Briggs. The land is still yours. You could rebuild if you wanted to, though we'd recommend some additional safety measures if you do. Tom was quiet for a moment, looking at the remains of his longtime home. Finally, he turned to Sarah. What do you think, sweetheart? Think your old man should rebuild? Sarah met his gaze, her expression serious. That's a big decision, Dad. Are you sure you're ready to be out here alone again? Tom smiled, a glint of his old determination in his eyes. Who said anything about being alone? I seem to remember someone expressing an interest in learning the ropes out here. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Then a slow smile spread across her face. Really? You'd want me to come out here with you? Nothing would make me happier, Tom said softly. This place, it's a part of me, but so are you, Sarah. Maybe it's time to bring those two parts together. Ranger Thompson cleared his throat. If you do decide to rebuild, Mr. Briggs, we'd be happy to provide some recommendations for bear-proofing the new structure. And I can't stress enough the importance of having reliable communication devices out here. Tom nodded, a wry smile on his face. Believe me, Ranger, I've learned that lesson the hard way. A satellite phone will be the first thing I install. As the Ranger prepared to leave, he paused, turning back to Tom. Mr. Briggs, I've been doing this job for over 2 decades, and I've never seen anyone survive an encounter quite like yours. The resilience you showed, well, it's remarkable. Tom felt a lump form in his throat. Thank you, Ranger. I appreciate that. After Ranger Thompson left, Tom and Sarah continued to sift through the cabin's remains. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, they decided to set up camp for the night, pitching a tent in a clear area near the cabin site. As they sat around a small campfire that evening, Tom found himself opening up about his experience in a way he hadn't before, even in therapy. You know, Sarah, he began, staring into the flames. When I was in that cabin, fighting for my life, I thought a lot about you, about how I might never see you again, never get to tell you how proud I am of the woman you've become. Sarah's eyes glistened in the firelight. Oh, Dad, Tom continued, his voice soft but steady. It made me realize how much I'd isolated myself out here. Don't get me wrong, I love this land, this life, but I lost sight of what's truly important. He reached out, taking his daughter's hand. That's why I want to rebuild, Sarah. Not just the cabin, but our relationship. I want to share this place with you, teach you everything I know about surviving out here. If you're willing to learn, that is. Sarah squeezed his hand, tears now flowing freely. I'd love that, Dad, more than anything. As they talked late into the night, Tom felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The terror of the attack would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had survived, he had healed, and now he was ready to move forward. The next morning, they began the process of clearing the old cabin site. As they worked, Tom found himself sharing stories of his life in the wilderness, the challenges he'd faced, the beauty he'd witnessed, the lessons he'd learned. Sarah listened eagerly, asking questions and soaking up every bit of knowledge her father shared. Tom felt a surge of pride at her enthusiasm and quick learning. As the sun reached its peak, they paused for a break. Tom wiped the sweat from his brow, surveying their progress. You know, he said thoughtfully, we could modify the design a bit, maybe add a second bedroom, make it more comfortable for visitors. Sarah grinned. Visitors? Like, say, your future grandchildren. Tom's eyes widened. Sarah, are you? She shook her head, laughing. Not yet, Dad, but Mike and I have been talking about it. And I'd love for my kids to know this place, to learn from their grandfather like I'm learning now. Tom felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the physical labor. The future he saw stretching out before him was far different from the solitary existence he'd led for so long, but it filled him with a joy he hadn't expected. As the day wore on, they began sketching out plans for the new cabin. Tom insisted on incorporating every safety measure possible, from reinforced doors and windows to a state-of-the-art communication system. "We'll make it a fortress," he declared, "but a cozy one." Sarah laughed. "A cozy fortress in the wilderness. Sounds perfect." As evening approached, they decided to take a short hike before dinner. Tom led the way along a familiar trail, pointing out various plants and animal signs to Sarah. As they reached a small clearing, Tom suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence. There, at the edge of the trees, was a brown bear, smaller than the one that had attacked Tom, but still an impressive sight. Sarah tensed, reaching for her father's arm, but Tom remained calm, a look of wonder on his face. The bear sniffed the air, then looked directly at them. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a snort, the bear turned and ambled back into the forest. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured. Sarah stared at her father in amazement. "Dad, how can you say that? After everything that happened?" Tom turned to her, a serene smile on his face. "Because it's true, Sarah. What happened to me was terrible, yes, but it doesn't change the fact that these creatures are an essential part of this ecosystem. This wilderness we love." He gestured around them. "This land, these animals. They were here long before us, and they'll be here long after. We're just visitors here, Sarah. Privileged ones, but visitors nonetheless." Sarah shook her head in wonder. "I don't know if I could ever be that forgiving." Tom put an arm around her shoulders. "It's not about forgiveness, sweetheart. It's about respect. Respect for the wilderness, for its beauty and its dangers. That bear that attacked me, it wasn't evil. It was just being a bear. I was the one who put myself in that situation." They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the beauty and wildness of their surroundings. "I think I understand now," Sarah said softly, "why you love it out here so much. It's not just about the solitude or the challenge. It's about being part of something bigger." Tom nodded, pride swelling in his chest at his daughter's insight. "Exactly, and that's what I want to share with you, with your future children. Not just how to survive out here, but how to truly live as part of this incredible world." As they made their way back to their campsite, Tom felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The attack had changed him, there was no denying that. But standing here now, with his daughter by his side and plans for the future taking shape, he realized it had changed him for the better. He had faced his fears, confronted the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life, and come out stronger. The nightmares might never fully disappear, but they no longer held power over him. As they reached their tent, Tom paused, taking one last look at the stunning Alaskan landscape, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with contentment, "I think this is the beginning of a new chapter for both of us." Sarah smiled, squeezing her father's hand. "I couldn't agree more, Dad. I couldn't agree more." As night fell over the wilderness, Tom Briggs felt truly at home for the first time in months. The road to recovery had been long and difficult, but standing here, on the precipice of a new adventure with his daughter, he knew that the best was yet to come. The bear attack had nearly ended his life, but in facing that trauma and coming out the other side, Tom had found a new purpose, a new connection to the land he loved, and a deeper bond with his family. As he drifted off to sleep that night, the sounds of the wilderness around him felt not like a threat, but like a welcome home.